The Compliance Life details the journey to and in the role of a Chief Compliance Officer. How does one come to sit in the CCO chair? What are some of the skills a CCO needs to successfully navigate the compliance waters in any company? What are some of the top challenges CCOs have faced, and how did they meet them? These questions and many others will be explored in this new podcast series. The Compliance Life is hosted by Tom Fox, and each month he'll present the story of one CCO through 4 episodes. The Compliance Life is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
This month, it's Susan Divers. In Part 1, Academic Career and Early Professional Life.
93% of your life is spent indoors, but so many of our favorite moments are outdoors. Fresh air, the feeling of peace. Warmer weather is almost here, so make the most of it with Outer, the new outdoor furniture company with purposely designed furniture to get you outdoors more. Everything Outer makes has a 5-star resort look and feel for less than you would pay at a big box store. Outer makes the world's most beautiful, comfortable, innovative, and high-quality outdoor furniture, all from sustainable materials. Outers has perfected the outdoor sofas, chairs, and tables that feature stunning modular design to customize your space. Life-proof material with a nano coating that's water, mold, bleach, and stain resistant, plus UV protected. Triple memory foam cushions that are comfier than most indoor sofas. And Outer's patented built-in outer shell cover protects your furniture from rain and dew. It's the "how did no one think of this before" invention that made Shark Tank's Lori Greiner and Mr. Wonderful fight to invest in Outer. Check out Outer's stunning furniture for yourself with a virtual tour or in person at one of the thousands of neighborhood showrooms. Outer furniture comes with best-in-class warranties and a 2-week trial with free returns. See the difference for yourself at liveouter.com/C-Suite. Plus, for a limited time, get $300 off and free shipping. This is Outer's best offer anywhere. Only available to podcast listeners and only for a limited time. Get $300 off and free shipping at liveouter.com/C-Suite. That's liveouter.com/C-Suite. Terms and conditions apply.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and welcome to another edition of The Compliance Life. Today, I'm absolutely thrilled to have my good friend, Susan Divers. Susan has been in compliance longer than most people, and she's got a really interesting journey. She's now Director of Thought Leadership at LRN and known to many people in the compliance profession. So, Susan, first of all, welcome, and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me.
Oh, Tom, it's a pleasure. And when you say friend, I totally endorse that. And also, I admire you. You've done more to put compliance and ethics and good practices on the map than practically anyone I can think of.
Well, thanks very much, Susan. So, Susan, could you tell us about your academic background and your early professional career a little bit?
Oh, sure, Tom. So I went to law school actually at night. I graduated from college in Washington, D.C., and then worked at the State Department and wound up taking the diplomatic service test and being admitted into a diplomatic class. But in the meanwhile, I had enrolled in George Washington Law School at night. And so I wound up finishing my law degree, even though I was offered some really interesting overseas assignments. And then I chose to be a lawyer rather than a diplomat. So I spent a year in the legal advisor's office actually working on the first initiative for an international corruption treaty at the UN. And then I went to England because I wanted to do a master's originally at LSE in, of all things, international tax. But I wound up working there in London for first a US firm, and then I worked for an English firm, and they said, why don't you qualify as a solicitor? And so I did. And that was really a wonderful thing to do because I got to see another legal system from the inside. And after that, after 4 years in London, I moved back to the States and went into private practice, first with Bob Strauss's law firm, Akin Gump, and then eventually became a partner at Sonnenshien, Nath and Rosenthal's DC office, which is now Denton's. And then I went in-house.
So I've not had anyone on the Compliance Life who is qualified to practice law in the United States and in the United Kingdom. I was wondering if you could just give a few remarks about the differences, not so much in the law, but really in the practice of law in the two countries.
For me, it was a wonderful experience because it was very different than the approach in the U.S. The approach in the U.S. is very practical, and in the U.K., it's much more, in a sense, academic, in a good sense, in that in those days, barristers, which are the part of the profession that actually argued cases, would take a gigantic stack of books into court with sticky notes, and they would read to the judges from different passages from cases. And as we know, that's not what happens here. And in those days, written pleadings were much less important. So there was a focus both on really going back and looking exactly at what the law said, and then a focus also on sort of oral argument and a dialogue with the judge, which was frequently quite learned. So I really liked that aspect of the practice, and I learned a lot from it. And I know it's changed somewhat, but it's still really rooted in what the cases actually say. And there's a lot of discipline in terms of how different doctrines are applied.
I remember I had a friend who was arguing an appeal in London, UK barrister, and I went down to watch it, and I was stunned where literally they did just what you said. They came in with a dolly full of books and with pages yellow tabbed, and they would sit there and read them all together. And then the court would ask what was the lawyer's opinions of the case and how it applied. I'd like to move to Akin Gump. You mentioned Bob Strauss. Actually, my best friend from my hometown went to work at Akin Gump in the 80s out of law school. Did you work for Bob Strauss?
I worked with him on a number of occasions. I worked for the international trade practice, and Bob got involved in that from time to time. And it was impossible not to like Bob Strauss. He was just such an intelligent, jovial, interesting, and insightful and shrewd person. And I remember I ran into him after I had left the Gump, as it was affectionately known. And I think I had become a partner at Sonnenshien at that point. I ran into him at Duke Ziebert's in D.C. at lunch, and he said, "So how are your two sons?" And I mean, he remembered, and he remembered their names, which was just phenomenal. So it was really a great thing to see someone like that and how they operated up close.
So he really was one of the late 20th century power brokers in Washington, particularly in Democratic circles. After you went, you mentioned you were in the international trade practice group at Akin Gump. Is that the practice you had when you went to Sonnenshien, or did you have another practice?
That was the practice I had, Tom. I've always had a deep practice both in anti-corruption and in export controls and sanctions. At Sonnenshien, I did some lobbying. It just evolved that way, mainly because I think I had some experience when I was at the Gump in that area. So I did some of that as well.
In the 90s, you moved in-house. I was wondering if you could talk to us about your move to SAIC, how that was different than the private practice you had been in and the types of roles you had at SAIC.
Sure. That is a serendipitous story. So I was actually standing in the law library at Sonnenshien on a Monday morning because a friend of mine was leaving the Gump, and she was a bit down about it. So I was going to look at the American Lawyer wanted ads and then sort of cheerleader, and I saw an ad from SAIC for an international lawyer, and specifically someone that was familiar with UK law, with anti-bribery, and I think they even mentioned export. Yeah, they did mention export controls. And I said, my goodness, that's me. So I put a resume in, and 6 weeks later, I went in-house. And I was the first lawyer on the East Coast. So that was challenging, just getting even a computer. Well, they were a good company, but they just weren't prepared to have a lawyer on the East Coast. And so getting an office, getting a computer, getting help, figuring out who was who. But I was there in the end 13 years, and it was just a wonderful experience.
Let me take a step back. Could you mention the American Lawyer? And the American Lawyer began, I think, when I was in law school. And pretty quickly it became a must read for every lawyer in the United States. And sort of the 80s and 90s were probably its heyday. It was gossipy. It had some law in it. You could follow the heavy hitters. So I was really interested that you picked up the American Lawyer, because we all picked up the American Lawyer back then.
I mean, you're right. It was like, I don't know if you remember I think it was Washington Post used to have a column called sort of Washington Ear, I think. And it was a gossip column, and everybody read that. And then that went out of circulation. And then everybody I knew read the American Lawyer. And it was that combination of sort of the gossipiness, but also the insights into what people were doing and how they were doing it.
I think the publisher was Stephen Brill was
Yes.
his name. And
Yes.
I remember he came to the University of Michigan Law School and spoke. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions about what was the practice in private practice of doing trade sanctions back in the 80s and early 90s. It's obviously very much to the fore today, particularly after the Russian invasion. But during the past administration, trade sanctions were really ramped up. Could you compare it to what your experience was kind of back then?
Yeah, and that's a really interesting question. Back then, it was very focused on export control regs. And this was before the big cases in export control started rolling in. And so we had a number of defense and tech clients, and that was in the 90s, so there weren't that many tech companies, but we would advise them on how to navigate and how to get licenses and how to proactively classify their products, not in the sense of security classifications, but just under the relevant regs. And I've always enjoyed that work, and I always found it really interesting to work with people on cutting edge technology. So that was a main part of the practice. There were some sanctions in place in those days, North Korea and Iran, and occasionally we would get a question about that. I remember we represented a candy maker, a big one, and we had to figure out if they could sell candy in Iran, and I think the answer was no, if I remember. But it was a pretty, I wouldn't say sleepy. It was an active regulatory practice, but now, as you know, it's much more front and center and top of dashboard.
Also, could you give a few remarks about the International Trade Compliance Bar? My sense was that, particularly back then, it was a relatively small group of people, certainly not the size that it is now, but that you really knew each other, and you would see each other represent different clients. And then, of course, some came from the government, so that there was that sort of dynamic going on. Do I have that sense right, or was it different?
You're right, Tom, with one tweak. Everybody pretty much did know everybody, and you'd see people on the same matters. And we represented mostly domestic industry. We represented a producer of oil country tubular goods who was located in Texas, for example, and they were having major issues with imports. And later on, when I was at Sonnenshien, I represented what was then the only integrated steel mill west of the Mississippi, on hot-rolled and cold-rolled steel. But the one tweak, I would say, is in those days, the bar really divided fairly starkly between those who represented domestic industry and those that represented foreign partners seeking, or foreign entities seeking access to the U.S. market. And that was when the dumping cases were really getting going.
Susan, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this first episode, but I hope our listeners will join us next time where we take a little bit deeper dive into your in-house career and your move to the CECO chair. Before we leave, if our listeners wanted any more information on yourself or any of the topics we've touched on, what would be the best way for them to find out more?
Well, probably, Tom, if they just reach out to me on LinkedIn or at LRN. I'm easy to find, but there's a lot of the things I've written about on LinkedIn, so I'm always directing people towards LinkedIn.
Susan, thanks so much, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thanks, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Thank you again for listening to this episode of The Compliance Life. I hope you will join me again next week where I take up another episode in The Compliance Life. The Compliance Life is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. If you would like to be featured on The Compliance Life, please give me an email at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Also, if you like this series, please give us a rating on iTunes. Any review and rating would definitely help get the word out about the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network. Thanks again.
This podcast is a part of the C-Suite Radio Network. For more top business podcasts, visit c-suiteradio.com.